Here is a timeline of the Coral Way bilingual program, and we call this the Coral Way bilingual program simply because when this program began, there was no real such thing as dual language, two-way immersion, one-way immersion, and other kinds of bilingual education programs. But I'm going to go across a span of timeline, you see about 40, 50 years, and so we'll go through some of this over time, and I'd like you to consider the contributions of bilingual education in the long term. So to get started, I'm going to ask a few questions. You don't have to put them in the chat, but you might think about them. Kara sent chapter 1 and the introduction of the book out to the members. And so if you haven't had a chance to read it, or if you have, you might test your knowledge here. There's 4 questions for you. The first question is, Coral Way opened its doors as the first dual language two-way immersion program in what year do you think? 1960, 61, 62, or 63? Easy guess. Hopefully you know the answer is 1963, okay? The second question is, the foundation that provided financial support for the Coral Way program was Gates, Kellogg, or the University of Miami Foundation? And the answer to this is C, the Ford Foundation. They have a lot of philanthropy and education that really changed in the 1960s. The Ford Foundation contributed in 1962 $128,000, $278,000, $398,000, or $598,000. And the answer to this one is B, $278,000, which today, when I calculated US dollars in current time, it's about 2.1 million. So not bad for a foundation in the 1960s to levy that amount of money in a school. And question number 4 is, the teaching assistants at Coral Way were referred to as bilingual aides, Cuban aides, teacher aides, or paraprofessionals. And the answer to this question is also B, Cuban aides. And I'd like to point out that the use of the ethnic or country marker would not probably be something that we would do today in education to identify a group. But I'll go into some of the details here. So I hope that you enjoy it. Up in the top left of the screen, you see this lovely Ghanaian image of the Sankofa. And I put that image there because the Sankofa reminds us that we look back toward the past in order to understand where our feet are going in the future. And so I see the symbolism of the Sankofa here as looking toward the future and the contributions of this work in the future of bilingual education. In this screen, you see that there's an image on the right side of the Coral Way Elementary School, and that's the front door of the building. From around the 1970s or so, this picture was taken. If you were to look at Coral Way today, you wouldn't see the same title at the top. It would say Coral Way K-8 Center. So in about 2004, the Coral Way School changed its focus from a K-6, kindergarten through grade 6 program, to a kindergarten through grade 8 program. So it added 2 additional years on, which is an opportunity for someone to look at additional scholarship. But this is an image from what the school looked like in the earlier years. The building was actually built in 1936, so it existed as an elementary school or primary school in the United States before it opened as a bilingual program. And on the left side of the screen, you see what's a fountain and a courtyard, very much in a sort of Cuban Mediterranean sort of style of where the courtyard was an important part of the back of the school, and the children gathered in the center. The fountain is a very important symbol for the school. But this story for me actually begins around 1997. And so hopefully I don't date myself too much, but I put a few images on there because in 1997, I started my program at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and Kathy Escamilla was my advisor. She does a lot of work in second language education. I was a Title VII, a U.S. Department of Education Title VII fellow at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And that's significant because Title VII is a funding stream for education that really came from the 1968 Bilingual Education Act. So I'm sort of positioning here a timeline where you see 1963, Coral Way Elementary School is opened as a bilingual program, later known to, or currently known as a two-way immersion program. I'll talk about that. And there was money from 1960s into the 1970s, 80s, and 90s to prepare bilingual teachers and scholars. I was one of those. And that's probably the first time that I heard the name Coral Way, although I'm not sure. It might have been a few years earlier when I did my master's degree. But I'm just attributing the knowledge and the history of policies to support bilingual programs from 1968 through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And you see there on the left, it says 1974 OBEMLA. That was the Office of Bilingual Education, Minority Language Assistance in the US Department of Education. This organization, this part of the US Department of Education does not exist anymore. Now the funding for bilingual education, if we have any, comes through the US Department of Education Office of English Language Acquisition, OELA. So that's changed, and that changes the landscape, if you would, of bilingual education in the United States. But I'd like to go back now to really 1959 to 1962. I'm not an educational historian, but I have had to learn a good bit about the Cuban refugee crisis in the context of what happened with bilingual education in the United States. For educational historians, don't clearly need me to point out that in 1959, the Cuban Revolution and Fidel Castro coming into power was a very significant event about 90 miles off the Florida coast. Prior to 1959, Florida had strong ties with the Cuban island, and there were, as you know, there were a lot of business exchanges. It was very much sort of a seamless relationship between Cuba and the United States, but lots of political and economic will and relationships that occurred prior to 1959, of course, albeit under Batista, the dictator in Cuba, or the government of Cuba, having relationships with the United States government for these sort of open door kinds of economic and political relationships. Wealthy Cubans came to Florida at the time. Wealthy Americans would go to Cuba to Havana for weekends and so on. So it's a very short flight from Florida to Cuba, and the geographic space made these relationships very important. But in 1959, Fidel Castro came into power. It was, you know, a big historical event. Of course, many Cubans decided at the time to leave the island, but the important piece of this, or two important pieces with respect to bilingual education, was one, that the Cuban people that stayed on the island really thought that this was going to be a temporary revolution, and that there would be resumed relationships with the United States and open relationships with people coming and going across the island to the United States mainland. And that really didn't happen like people actually thought it would. Another important event that happened when Fidel Castro came into power was, of course, under the communist government, there was this idea among families and parents that children, a very Catholic country, children and families could no longer worship the Catholic and practice their Catholic faith. There were ideas that the communist government did close down, in fact, and imprison some priests and religious clergy. And so families at the time thought it was safer for their children to actually, many of them safer for their children to leave the Cuban island and come to the United States. And this is what you see here, this idea of this line here, Operation Pedro Pan, Operación Pedro Pan, was, it's a really not well documented, somewhat documented event that is more known in community in South Florida than most places in the United States. Under Pedro Pan, more than 14,000 children from Cuba were put on airplanes twice a day and brought to the Miami airport, where they were sort of left alone and put into or placed into family homes. This context for the Coral Way program, because clearly you can see that there were about 20 or so thousand children between 1959 and 1961 or so, 62, that were brought to the United States, many without parents or families, and were registered and enrolled in the public schools, in Dade County public schools. And this became known as the Cuban problem in terms of education. There was really no extra money for the school district to address how to provide education for Cuban children that didn't speak English. Not all of them were beginning learners of English at the time. Some had some English language preparation and education in Cuba, in the Havana area, because they had teachers that spoke English. And so Cuban children came at different language levels and were registered. Many of them registered in Miami-Dade, or Dade County at the time. It was not Miami-Dade County Public Schools. Some of the children that came under Operation Pedro Pan, however, were brought to other places in the United States. And there have been books and movies made about this phenomenon. A famous one is, Waiting for Snow in Havana. And this is a book by Carlos Ede, who is a Cuban American author, who wrote about his experience as a Pedro Pan child, and he came to the US with his brother, but you can read more about that. The important thing on this slide, though, is that Dade County Public Schools, under the superintendent, decided that in order to address this, quote, Cuban problem, he had to hire someone to figure out a solution. He immediately went back and made some connections and realized that he could hire someone in the local community who had been working in the Cuban refugee resettlement program in Miami, a woman and a linguist by the name of Pauline Rojas. Dr. Rojas was a more mature linguist in her late 50s at the time. She was married to a Puerto Rican man. She had taught English as a second language in Puerto Rico and had worked very closely with Charles Fry's to set and establish and roll out the Fry's Reader Series for second language literacy. So Pauline is a real key player in what happened, and really the mind and the thinking behind the establishment of Coady as a bilingual program. When I think about it, and having read through the archives, she would probably be the primary person whose work really paved the way for the Coady program as a bilingual education program opening in 1963. A few more things here that you already know. One that you might not know is the orientation program was the first thing that Pauline set up when she came into Dade County Public Schools. This was a program where the school district hired Cuban aides. This is where the term came from. They actually hired prepared teachers who resettled in Miami-Dade as aides to work in classrooms and to translate and interpret and work alongside a native English-speaking teacher. The orientation program really was geared toward the low English language proficiency level students. The Cuban aides were not allowed really to work with more proficient students in the classroom because the need was so great for them to work with beginning English learners in regular public classroom settings. So Pauline established the orientation program, and then she did one important, critical, pivotal thing. She realized that in order for Dade County to address the language problem and the Cuban crisis, she had to go to Washington, D.C. and ask for money from the federal government. Many of us know that when you fly to Washington, or you fly to your country's capital and you ask for money for education, you're most likely going to get the answer, there's none. And that's exactly what happened with Pauline Rojas. She flew to Washington, D.C. in 1961 when she was hired, and she went to the U.S. Department of Health, Welfare, and Education. There was no U.S. Department of Education at the time, so she went to that program and she asked for funding. She was told they had no money to help with the Cuban problem, but she was advised to go to the Ford Foundation by employees there. And so she did. She never left the Northeast. She went immediately to New York City, and she basically went to the Ford Foundation and sat and waited till she could speak with someone and asked about funding to help Dade County Public Schools. And she was given some positive feedback, and she established a connection with someone there, Edward Mead there, who later she went back and forth and developed a proposal for funding for Dade County Public Schools. So that was really a key moment in the establishment of Coady. I want to say that it took about 2 years for this proposal, which you can read in the Ford Foundation archives, the proposal to be established by Pauline Rojas. And eventually in 1962, the Ford Foundation funded Dade County Public Schools to do only 2 things. One was for teacher education for ESL materials, and for the Cuban aids, to prepare Cuban aids to become teachers. So Ford Foundation was very clear at the beginning. They did not want to fund a bilingual program. That was Pauline's vision, but they did fund these two things. And as many of us realize, when we get grant funding, we do propose, and in good faith, carry out these tasks, but sometimes we do different things with the money. And that's what happened here with Coral Way. Okay, I'm gonna go a little more quickly here so we have some time. This particular slide shows you that when the Coral Way program was established, there were 7 original goals of the people that founded it. It was Pauline Rojas. She hired a man named Paul Bell, whom she knew in her work through in Puerto Rico. She also hired a few other people into the program that helped. One is a character and an important scholar as well, Rosa Inclán. She emigrated to the United States after being imprisoned in Havana for some time, and became a really important contributor to the program. And together, these people, when they conceptualized the Coral Way program, there were 7 original goals. I won't read them over. You can read them in the archives and in the book, but you can see I coded 2 of them in blue. I did that because you can see the first 2 goals really focused on language. So achieving, the pupil will achieve skills, abilities, and understandings as he would have had he attended a monolingual school. That was the language at the time, using the masculine article here. And then the second one, that he would be as proficient in his second language as in his first. So there were really only 2 language goals for the Coral Way program. If you look down, the other 5 goals really had much more to do with culture, with vocation, potential, which is interesting because today we think about these neoliberal pressures in terms of bilingual programs and gaining jobs and so on. Those were very much part of the thinking of the founders of the Coral Way program in 1962 when they established it. And you can see they really had a long-term goal of people thinking about leading a richer, fuller, and more satisfying personal life. So again, the interesting thing is they had no way to measure many of these goals, but they did put them out there thinking that Coral Way as a program would have a long-term effect socially, economically, on the participants in the program. I find that really fascinating back then. So in January, really the funding came in from the Coral Way program. It was $278,000. And as I mentioned, it was for teacher professional development and curriculum and materials. You see some of these materials here. On the left side here is a page from the teacher manual. They used the audiolingual method at the time of teaching, very repetitive. Some of the teachers later who are still alive today and used these Miami linguistic readers said that they were the most boring things they ever had to use to teach, really didn't like the materials. And then here you see there's a material here that comes from the Miami linguistic readers. It's the only series, these were basal readers for ESL. The only material I found that really had Spanish in it, and you can see from this image that this was very much an image, traditional image of Mexican workers, low-income Mexicans, and mariachi playing, and you can read this particular story, B is for bicycle, a fascinating story in the Miami linguistic readers. I'd like to focus here on something from a quote from Josefina Sanchez Pando. Josefina Sanchez Pando was another key woman player in the Coral Way program. She actually arrived in Miami in 1961 with her daughter. She left Cuba, Havana. She had a PhD in linguistics and was an English as a foreign language teacher in Havana, at the University of Havana. She has a profile very to the other Cuban aides at the time. Many of the teachers who stayed with Coral Way were teachers that had PhDs in linguistics and were prepared as educators. And when they came to the United States, their credentials, they couldn't bring credentials with them. So Dr. Sanchez Pando became a teacher in the Coral Way program. She's a very interesting story, but I'd like for you to just hear her voice and the passion in her voice. These were data that were collected by Dr. Richard Ruiz back in about 2007 or 2008 for Dr. Sanchez Pando, and I'll let you hear what she says about experience in the teacher education program once she got to the University of Miami in the 1960s.
Before the bilingual project started, and it started only in Coady, and believe me, that was a hard delivery. You really had to push to get that going. There were rooms in which a Cuban teacher, who was called a Cuban aide, because she wasn't a teacher, she had no papers here. And that's where the University of Miami saw a bridge. They saw a little hole and they said, wow, look what's coming in here. And I tell you this because I belonged to the first group. And we were called the Marines at the university. We were called the group, there comes a group of the Marines, because we were opening space for others to come behind us. We had a very rough time at the University of Miami. I mean, the roughest, the meanest, the most denigrating time that anybody, those first two groups of teachers, we sweated it out. We were Marines. Our corps paved the way for the rest of all the teachers and all the programs and all the bilingual things. We paid for it. We paid for it immensely.
Yes, so she says we paid for it immensely. I think that really underscores the hard work that I probably haven't well conveyed to this point, and the commitment of the teachers who became part of the bilingual education program. Again, just called at the time the Coady Bilingual Program. So she's a really important character. And what's interesting about Dr. Sanchez Pando is she stayed with the program for more than 25 years and was very committed, had strong relationships, and the students really look back and remember her as really having commitment and shaping their understanding of Spanish and understanding of sort of Pan-American history and all that she knew, and she taught them in the curriculum. They're very fond memories of her. But she was not easy. They also talk about how tough she really was. As you know, the program actually opened up its doors on September 3rd, 1963, so keep that date in mind. And many people ask me about the model. What happened? Today in dual language programs, we call dual language programs, which is, I think, in my mind, a shorthand term for what is really known today more specifically as two-way immersion programs. There's this idea that there are two different language groups of students. And in bilingual programs, in two-way programs, we try to keep a pretty set balance of 50% speakers of one language and 50% of the other language. And that's for all kinds of social status purposes, for language development purposes, and so on. And that really was the idea behind Coady. I want to point out here, if you were to read in the book, and if you look at in the book, you see that there's some language from the 1970s, some writing surrounding Pauline Rojas and her thinking behind the program. She actually had been working for the Center for Applied Linguistics in Washington, D.C. for many years, and had traveled around the world and had some input on two-way programs or 50-50 models of programs from other places. In my research, looking at the archives and really digging, I think she took her inspiration for this program from a program in Ecuador. So I have some evidence to think that, but when she came to Miami, one of the things she realized was she had to establish this 50-50 balance of speakers of the two languages. And that's what she did. She worked very closely with the principal, Coady, who is a man named Logan. He went by Lee, L-E-E, Logan, L-O-G-A-N. And Mr. Logan was very committed. He was quite a character. He liked the spotlight. He loved to have people come in and see his program. And he painstakingly documented for about 15 years every person who came into Coady and observed the program. He kept every letter of thank you, and those are all in the archives that I'll show you. So Pauline Rojas and her team developed this, thought about this model, took inspiration probably from a program around another program in the world, and they worked with Mr. Logan to bus in Spanish speakers into the neighborhood. This was a neighborhood public school, and it was a neighborhood that had English speakers already. Now, let me just paint for you the picture that this was not a very typical neighborhood of the time. The area was very much a Hebrew-speaking neighborhood. There are several Jewish synagogues located in this area. Many of the English-speaking children went to synagogue on the weekends and went to Hebrew school. So they had already a mindset of bilingualism or multilingualism in the community. It was kind of a very close to downtown Miami. So it was kind of a vibrant area. But importantly, they chose the Coral Way program, the Coral Way School, because the founders of this program felt that it was economically that there was enough of a middle-class environment in which Cuban refugee children could come in and be provided housing and be bused in, and it wouldn't be a very disruptive area. They very much thought about the economic environment and the social environment and choosing that school. And again, Mr. Logan was a character. He really wanted the program and he loved the attention. He himself tried to learn and spoke some Spanish. He would reportedly get his hair cut to the Cuban barber and speak Spanish with people in the community. So there was this sort of sense of, of language being a positive resource. And so there were 50-50, about 50-50. I also want to point out really importantly that at the time there were no language screeners. So today in the United States, we use language screeners and home language surveys to determine what children's first language might be. In 1962 and 63, when they started the program, basically the teachers got together and looked at students' last names and decided if your last name was Hernandez, then you were probably a Spanish speaker and we're gonna put you in the Spanish side of the program. If your last name was Smith, we're gonna put you in the English side of the program. They realized within the first year that that was not the best way to place students, partly because, remember, when children came to the United States, they often landed in Miami, and under the program that was established for them, the children that had been sent alone were sent off to other places in the United States, and eventually within a year or two made their way back to Miami when their families arrived from Cuba. So for instance, you might have a child, Maria Hernandez, who went to school in Boston, Massachusetts for 2 years and had early literacy in English, then came back to the Miami area, ended up in the neighborhood of Coral Way Elementary School with her family, with her family of origin, who came from Cuba, her grandmother and her mother, maybe a father, and then had no literacy development in Spanish, but was put into the Spanish side of the program. So you could see that within a year or two, certainly within the first 2 years, there was a lot of confusion surrounding first language literacy development and levels, second language literacy development levels, and where children should be placed. So I unraveled that a little bit more in the book for you, but it was really interesting what happened. The model really was a 50-50 model based on student background. And what you see here, though, is the first grade, this is in the archives, the time distribution of children. If you notice that in the first, for example, first grade children, when the program started, in the first 4 weeks of school, had most of their instruction in their vernacular or in their first language, and very little in their second language, whether it was English or Spanish. By the second month of first grade, the day got longer for them. The children spent more time in school, and you can see that they had less time in their first language and more time in their second language. And if you hop all the way down toward the end of school, you can see that the children had longer days, and you can see about half of their day. You can see nothing was really 50-50. They played very much around with the amount of time children were spent in content area instruction in second language. This middle column here is very important. And you see here that 95 minutes a day. The 95 minutes a day in the middle of the school day was when the children from Spanish-speaking backgrounds and English-speaking backgrounds, and by the way, they were separated. They were not in mixed groups. The English-speaking children and the Spanish-speaking children were separate through the whole model until after about 3 years into the program. There was some mixing, but the middle of the day, the children were given what was called relaxed language time. And this was when the Cuban aides really took over the instruction. They gave them art, physical education, they supervised lunch. It wasn't the regular music, it wasn't the regular teachers that provided this instruction. The classroom teachers, math, science, social studies, the classroom teachers spent 95 minutes a day co-planning. And Mr. Logan, the principal, says that the key success to the program at the time was the ability for the teachers to spend that amount of time planning together. So they really made sure that there was some overlap in the content, but they were building the language, the language vocabulary and the language for children across content areas. And they planned that very strategically. So I'd like to just, you can see here, I'm gonna go down to this piece. Another person who was very important in Coady at the time was a woman named Maria Tita Piñero. Tita Piñero was nominated for Teacher of the Year after having been in the Coady program for many years. She was, you can see, a third grade teacher. The students also remembered her fondly. And if you just notice her background, 1951, she did her bachelor's. She graduated with her doctorate in education pedagogy from the University of Havana in 1960. And she was a Cuban aide at Coady and also later became a classroom teacher. Again, another beloved person from Coady. I'd like for you to hear just a little from Tita Piñero here.
The list is that at the end of the day, we were exhausted because we have to plan and we have to make everything, you know, from scratch, because we didn't have the material. That was the thing that was really a burden for us. And also, for example, if you have a bilingual class, you have 2 sets of parents. And in open house, I mean, you didn't have time to talk to everybody. And that was the thing that I was like a minus because of the hard work and then this is what I think that to become, being in a bilingual class, you have to love the program. That's the thing. You have to be, to say bilingual is great, and then try to apply, and maybe the headaches you have, I say, well, I really like, and this I'm doing I like.
Okay, so you see she's talking about open house, and what she means is when parents come to the school at the beginning of the year, the pressure for her to engage with all of the parents, and that she also put into developing this program. And at the bottom of that slide, you could see that there were very limited student achievement data. I'll get to that in just a little bit and tell you that there were standardized tests back in the 1960s, quite a few were used. There were strategic intelligence tests that were given across Dade County Public Schools. The program did implement a language proficiency test that was the Inter-American Cooperative Test. It was based and it was normed on Puerto Rican students at the time. And I talk a little bit more about that in the book. I'm just going to share a few more minutes with you, some more of the data that come from the archives that are available to you. In this image, you see a boy with his eyes kind of closed. This is a man by the name of Orestes Gonzalez. He was a participant in the program in 1963. He lives in New York now, and he's become a photographer in his time. He's made it his second career. He invested heavily in real estate in New York and became very successful. But I'd like for you to hear a little bit from, he was from Cuban background, and he talks about being in the program and what it meant to him at the time. So.
I don't know if I'm coloring my nostalgia, but everybody seemed pretty happy, even in spite of the fact that of the trauma of having to leave Cuba and what was happening in Cuba at the time. The school environment was very happy and positive and very healthy. And we didn't have a sense of us versus them. I think there was a pretty good sense of integration between the American kids and the Spanish kids. I do recall that there were some American-speaking parents that resented the program, and they either pulled the kids out, and obviously the ones that were left were parents that accepted the program and thought it was positive.
So you can see this was a program that was not without its controversy, even though overwhelmingly the participants, the students in the program, looking back, overwhelmingly in their interviews describe Coral Way as having a very positive memory of the program, and they worked very hard in it. There are a couple of participants I've interviewed that said, well, you know, I really didn't see the point of being in a bilingual program. This became a Harvard graduate law attorney in Florida who fights for civil rights, but he was very successful and bilingual, but he didn't see the point of the program. But overwhelmingly, the participants, a few dozen of them now in our database, say that the program had a positive influence on their life. Kind of goes back to some of the early goals of the program, what it meant to the children to be part of the program. This is an image in the same picture of Bess DeFarber. I'll tell you a little bit more about Bess, but first I'd like to show you some of Bess's report cards. Here you see Bess started Coral Way Elementary School when she was in 1st grade. Her mother was Argentinian. Her father was a Russian speaker. Her last name being DeFarber put her in the English side of the program, even though her mother tongue was Spanish. She spoke Spanish with her mother, who was a nurse in the Miami area. And I just want to point out her report card from 1962 is in her 1st grade. She had the regular language arts, reading, English, spelling, writing, social studies, and you can see her grades, right? So she wasn't so good in science. She was pretty good in some of these areas, but you can see down here, I think you can see it says conversational Spanish. And you can notice that Bess received an A in conversational Spanish because it was her mother tongue. She did pretty well in Spanish. And so that's how the report card was sent out in 1st grade. As they moved into the bilingual program though, I'd like for you to see what happened. The report card changes and you see it says first language, English. Remember, she was in the English speaking side underlined, and then second language, Spanish. So the report card changed and the teachers would underline the language, the first and second language of the children. And so I just wanted to point that out. I also might go back here just for a second to this one. I want you to see that under here in 1963, her 1st grade teacher was Mabel Richardson. Mabel Richardson was a key person in Coral Way in our story today because she's the only piece of data that we have on how well students achieved in Coral Way from the 1960s. The data I mentioned on student achievement from Dade County Public Schools was essentially lost. I heard informally, anecdotally, by some educators that it was accidentally thrown away in the 1970s. But we do have one dissertation from Mabel Richardson, who did a dissertation, a doctorate in education in 1968 from the University of Miami. And her dissertation, we received permission from the University of Miami to put it in the archives. And the data, I reanalyzed what I could in the data, had no standard deviations and things, but it's in the book. So you might want to take a look at that if you're interested in student achievement data. This slide, just as a way of paints the story. Here's Richard Ruiz on the left-hand side of the screen. His wife, Marie, gave me this picture of him. It's her favorite picture of Richard. He passed away in 2016. And basically, the story of Coral Way, Richard started collecting data with Bess DeFarber in 2007, 2008. But the data, the project kind of stopped when Richard went forward in his career. Besta Farber, who became a grants librarian, moved to Florida, to the University of Florida, and basically brought the project with her, but it was left for about 10 years until I met her in 2017 and 2018, and we revived the program and collected more data, more interview data, and we dug into the archives. I found the Ford Foundation archives and other data that you can find on our database. This is a picture on the right of Tita Piñero, whom you just heard. And then just going to go forward here a little bit more to end the presentation, just to show you that today we have archives on the University of Florida. You can go to the University of Florida. You can see UFDC here, which stands for the University of Florida Digital Collection. We created an archive. We actually received permission from the University of Arizona, where Richard had been a professor, and permission from them to not only duplicate, but actually to receive the archival data from his early project. And we did that, and we were able to code all of it and use keywords, and as we imported it into our project here at UF, so it has keywords, and the project is completely searchable. You'll find things there, let me go back here, you'll find things there like my interview with Amy Porter Dassault, who really has quite a story. She and her mother were big fans of the program. Her mother wrote letters to the school district, the program, and so on. So Amy Porter, we have interviews in there from other people that participated in the program, and you can search all of that. You'll also see more empirical data, more pieces here from what the classrooms look like, the schedule looked like for the students, 1964, 1965, what a daily schedule looked like for students. You'll find pictures here from the students. There is no snow in Miami. And you probably wonder, why is this picture here? This is because the students really had a beloved, strong relationship with their teachers. And when they went away on vacation over the winter break, they sent pictures back of themselves to their teachers. And some of the pictures were children discovering snow, for example. So it's fascinating as an example of the relationship they had. And you'll find also letters that were written to Dr. Hall, the superintendent, supporting the program, and also references to parents that dissented. Very few, but some that did not agree with the opening of the bilingual program and were conservative in their ideology. So not terribly dissimilar from some of the controversial parental positions we find today in bilingual education programs 50 years later. And again, this is an image from Dr. Richardson, her dissertation. You can find it in the archives, and it's basically some achievement data are there, very interesting data that you can search through with permission. And I'd just like to end by saying, you know, how do we answer the question going back 50 years, 55 years, did it work? Remember the early asked about the long-term effects on students. We see that there was some increase in language proficiency in both languages among the I won't go too deep into this here, but what this really shows is the question, the first question that the founders had was, will students be able to learn in school through the medium of 2 languages without loss to their first? That was a basic question in the 1960s. It's a question we don't really ask anymore because we have answers to this, but the Core Way program shows that students, yes, increased their language proficiency and learned in education through the medium of 2 languages without loss to their first. And so it answered that basic question about bilingual instruction. And then the second thing you see is just a table here showing how there were in these raw scores, and very way Dr. Richardson compiled her data and how she groups students. We would not do that today, but you'll see that there is an increase in students' language proficiency levels over time across 2 languages. You can look more carefully at those data. One thing that we know, and we go back to these, we were able to answer some of these questions from the early program, and I think we can see that people students say they had a richer, fuller, and more satisfying personal life as a result of Coral Way. And so I'm just going to leave you here with this idea that where are we today in Florida in bilingual education programs? Well, very sadly, in Florida, we are an official English state. And so even though Florida had the first program in opening in 1963, we have about 12 or 13 school districts, these are the name of districts, that have bilingual programs today. Sadly, we don't have it documented by the Florida Department of Education, and we're working very hard to change that. So we have our work cut out for us in bilingual education in Florida. But I'm happy to report that we have more than 3,000 dual language two-way immersion programs in the United States today. Are they a direct result of Coral Way? I don't know. I can say that Coral Way, the data from Coral Way was used to inform the Bilingual Education Act in 1967 and 1968, signed by President Johnson. I do think Coral Way has made an important impact on bilingual education programs in the long term. And I also want to say that the Coral Way program still exists today as a two-way immersion program in Miami-Dade. And they've graduated thousands of students from the program who are highly proficient and very dedicated teachers. The program has expanded so much, they've added buildings on to the program. So I think I'll leave it there, and I'm sure that there might be questions. I'm sorry that I've gone a little bit over time, and I can open it up. Kara, if you'd like to let me know how you'd like to handle the questions.
Sure, well, I'll chime in already. There's been some questions in the chat room, so I'll start with those, and then maybe as people begin to think of other questions, they can ask directly or through the chat room, if that sounds good. So there's a question in from Lucy Spence, who's actually my colleague here at University of South Carolina, wondering if there was a final report to the Ford Foundation that you had access to.
Yes, very good question. Now, I want to point out with the archival data that the Ford Foundation, it's fascinating, philanthropic organizations that fund education. The archives can be requested through what's called the Rockefeller Dimes Foundation. So there's an actual location in New York State that's owned by the Rockefeller organization, and they house all of the Ford Foundation archives. And you can go onto those. You have to request them. I wasn't given permission to put the Ford Foundation archives onto the University of Florida, and I have to acknowledge them in books and in writings from their work. But you can see a final report in the archives. It wouldn't be the kind of formal report that we might do for the US Department of Education and so on. In other words, we don't have student achievement data listed in that final report. It really has a lot to do with the use of the funding, the $278,000. And it ends with this sort of anticlimactic story about Dr. Pauline Rojas basically leaving Dade County Public Schools and going back into kind of retiring. And I'm not really sure what happened to her. So it's got this sort of nebulous kind of ending to it. But there is a final report. It does speak to the funding, the use of the funding. Ford Foundation did realize in the end that their funding was also used for the Coral Way program. It's referenced in the archives. It's just that at the beginning of those archives, they mentioned that they didn't really, in their notes to each other, among the executives, they did not want to fund a bilingual program. They do recognize that ESL materials were in high need in the Southwest United States. There was also the Chicano, the Latin Chicano movement this Cesar Chavez and the migrant worker rights movement was part of the conversation. They also recognized that the ESL and teacher training materials would be used with Puerto Rican and Dominican immigrant schools that had Puerto Rican and immigrant students in the Northeast, in the New York City and Boston area. So they had a longer term idea of what the funding would be used for. Again, at the end, they recognized that Coral Way was one use of the funding.
Thank you, Maria. That was a fascinating presentation.
Thanks, Lucy.
Great. Well, you already touched a bit on the question that Carol Benson from Teachers College in New York is asking about what it takes to get archives and data like this up on a university website with open access. So you mentioned some of the Ford Foundation archives you were not permitted to put those up, right, on the open access site. But could you talk us through this process?
Yes, very much. Thank you so much, Carol, because this is, as a scholar of second language and bilingual education, we're not really prepared to do this level of work. It was actually a whole team of people on the back side at the University of Florida who made this project a priority. So I have to really thank the University of Florida library system. There were key people in terms of Bess DeFarber, whom I mentioned, works at the University of Florida library system in the grants area. Bess was able to network and get us some funding to help to take these archives from the University of Arizona and also to create a new set of archives. We hired student assistants, not for a lot of money, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, but we hired university library assistants. Our education librarian, Brittany Kester, was unbelievable. She was able to work with other librarians to go through each piece of data that we received from the University of Arizona and identify keywords, put keywords onto those data and basically put them into the University of Florida digital collection. So there were different steps that happened. The first was really getting permission from the university, connecting with people in Arizona, asking them if we could duplicate their archives. And they spent about 6 months going back and forth and said, instead of duplicating, replicating, we would just like to bequest, I guess, or allow you to take the archives because we feel it's a Florida program and it should maybe be in Florida. So that was one big step. The other part was to go back through all of the interviews that had been done, get them transcribed, and create new interviews, transcribe those and upload to the set. We did a lot of on-the-ground work with the Ford Foundation. We used their archives and referenced them. We weren't able to put them in our set, but people can go to Rockefeller and get them. We also went through and identified all of the Miami linguistic readers we could. We had to get public publication access for those publisher releases to put those online. I went to obituary sites, for instance, to find out what happened with Pauline Rojas, what happened to Rosa Inclán, and these people. We went to the University of Miami. They have a Cuban resettlement of refugees. They have a site dedicated to the Cuban refugee crisis, University of Miami, and we were able to get, again, Dr. Richardson's dissertation. They graciously allowed us to photocopy that and put that up on the site. So there were many people involved, and I've learned a lot by networking with others, and I'm happy that it's available for other scholars to use.
Thank you. Anyone else want to chime in here with a question? Okay.
I can read my question.
Great, go for it,
Yeah.
Laura, the co-chair.
Maria, first of all, thank you for this wonderful presentation, and we're really welcoming of what you have to offer to the LISIG. And Kara, I cannot thank you enough for all the organization, wonderful organization of Maria's presentation. So my question goes into the population served by the Coral Way program. And so I did write my question, but I can definitely voice it now. So the program served, you tell me if I'm wrong, please, served mainly middle class students, right? students coming from middle-class families. And so this is definitely such an important program that, you know, continues to the day. Is that still the case? Would you say that the populations that are served by this program are still coming from middle-class families? And that's my dog in the background. And so is that still the case today? And how, you know, how this helps or not with the sustainability of the program and the population, you know, and whether you feel that you can use this as a leverage to advocate for bilingual education in the case of Florida today.
Yeah, really. Thank you for the questions, Laura, and it's really nice to see you. Well, I guess I should go back a little bit. One of the things I mentioned was that the school itself, Coral Way, was chosen primarily because of this. It's written like this: the stable economic neighborhood. The neighborhood was considered stable economically, and so that was important to people founding the program because they wanted children to be committed to the neighborhood school and to stay part of the program. Early on, the neighborhood, as I mentioned, was probably bilingual, Hebrew, English, and so on. Now my dog's turn, right? So they were committed to the program as a neighborhood school. Some of the early Cuban children that came early on were from middle-class backgrounds, but not all of the children were. And I want to point out that Besta Farber, who was in the neighborhood, her family actually was not, they moved to the neighborhood because of the Hebrew-speaking neighborhood that it was, but her father basically bought their house from an estate sale. So they got their house very cheaply. So it wasn't completely middle class. Best lived across the street from the school. So the initial Cuban children that came in the program were more middle class than later on. They did, however, have to bus some of the children from other areas into the school for the initial 3 or 4 years. It took about 4 years for the neighborhood to become more linguistically integrated. So the children that were bused in were not necessarily from middle-class backgrounds. It was kind of a mix. They took the Cuban children from other areas to make that 50-50 composition. And then after about 4 years, it was pretty much a naturally 50-50 environment. But the middle class, the interesting thing about the neighborhood was the cost of the housing. So you asked the question, like, is it still a middle class neighborhood today? And when you go to Coral Way, you see the school, the cost of the housing, like we see in many bilingual programs across the United States, the cost of the housing in these neighborhoods has gotten more and more expensive. So in the 1960s, Coral Way, it's only about 4 or 5 miles from downtown Miami. It's pretty close, but that distance now means that the price of the housing has gone up and up over time. So new families coming into the neighborhood today can't afford to buy housing in the Coral Way area. In fact, I'm just going to quote Susana Martin. She is the lead teacher in the lead teacher and does teacher professional development at Coral Way today. She's a really great colleague and has allowed me access to the school. Susanna was saying that she lives in the neighborhood and they couldn't afford, if they had to today, buy a house in the neighborhood. Starting this year, they have really been challenged to keep their Title I funding. So let me back up for the international audience. What that means is low-income school districts receive supplemental educational funding from the federal government when their families are low income, from low income backgrounds. It's called Title I funding. I mentioned earlier being a Title VII fellow. Titles are block funding that comes into the educational programs to the states from the federal government. So the school district received Title I funding for many, many years, for decades. And now these past few years, they're really not going to receive Title I funding because the neighborhood has become so expensive. The families now are much more middle class. So I guess the long answer to Laura's shorter question was, there have been demographic actual shifts in terms of backgrounds of the students over time. Originally, the way I see it is that there were middle class background, and then they brought in lower income background students that were Spanish speaking students to create the program. And it stayed pretty much a low income to middle income neighborhood. And now over time, with the gentrification of the program and the cost of the housing, it's become more and more expensive for families to access the neighborhood school. It's still a bilingual program, and what I'd love to see a scholar really take up is the Coady program today. It actually has a special agreement with the government of Spain. The teachers actually, you know, in Florida, Florida has an agreement. We hire teachers from Spain to teach in this particular program. So it's got a very high status component to the program. The high achieving children can stay after school in Coady and do supplementary language programs and follow the advanced placement Spanish advanced curriculum from the Spanish government. And when the children graduate from 8th grade, they get a special mark on their diploma for receiving, for having gone through the native Spanish curriculum. So you see there's the bilingual program, and then there's another component that's a high status component on the program as well. So the school itself has gone through quite a bit of change over time. And what's interesting for Florida is, yes, I think we need to promote the linguistic resources in the state. You know, we really need to move beyond this official English status. We sort of see it as like an identity crisis. You know, it's a multilingual state with a rich history of bilingualism, biliteracy, bilingual education, and we're sort of stuck in this socio-political environment of it's a pretty conservative state politically. So this is why we've been going back through creating the Bilingual Education FL website. I'll be updating that this summer with the new districts that are doing dual language programs, but we really need to be documenting and making accessible to a general public the work that we do promoting bilingualism. And that's a big challenge. I think honestly now in the current context with the, for example, coronavirus, a few years ago, it was of course the violence in the state of Florida and guns. And there seems to be always something on the political agenda that seems to usurp or take over our agenda of moving bilingual education through the legislative process. So we are all the time working on really honestly working on the political side to promote bilingual education, native language assessments, and so on. It's an uphill battle.
All right, this might be the concluding question because we still have to deal with birthdays at the end.
Yeah.
So this final question is coming from Kazakhstan, from Asel Kambetirova, and she is wondering about the parents' attitudes. So she read the first chapter and was noting about the American parents expressing resentment toward the fact that their children were placed together with the Cuban children in one class. And she's wondering how these parents' positions have changed in the course of time, and if you know what the attitudes are these days.
Oh yes, that's a very good question. So you'll see different ideologies, even going back from 1962 when the program was first announced as opening up. And before, you could find in what was the Miami Herald, the newspaper at the time, did publish different views of parents, not a lot, but we have them in the archives, different views of parents when the Cuban children came into the United States. So the attitude at the time, you know, I try to make this connection, maybe it's not so tight in the book, but think about the 1960s in the United States. We had going on in the background at the federal level, the Office of the Civil Rights Movement, and a lot of progression and education at the time. And that sets the background a little bit. Then you have the Cuban situation and Cuban refugees coming into the Dade County area. There was a sense of, I'm gonna say this and hopefully not regret it, but there was a sense very much of this like goodwill and the pobrecitos, like this sort of American sort of like, we need to help these children and reach out to them. And of, bring them, help them out. And so we're gonna take children into the community and so on. And that sense of like goodwill and a little bit of saviorism, right, coming in when the children came into Dade County in the 1960s was kind of coupled with this sense of like, okay, language might be an important part of our community, and we're going to promote this as a resource. But at the same time, like in a way today, there was this conservative view, like when the children came into the United States in the regular mainstream classroom, before the dual language program, before the Coady program, in the regular classroom, parents were upset that their children, their English-speaking children, did not have access to the curriculum. And they write that in the newspaper. My children are not able to access high quality curriculum because there are Spanish speaking children and the teacher has to teach to that level. So there were these competing discourses at the time as well, right around the time that Coady was established. That's why when Pauline Rojas came in, the orientation program became the first step, an important first step, where Dade County could say back to those parents, okay, well, we're going to bring in special prepared people, bilingual people, to work with the Cuban children to help them in language. So the mainstream teacher can work at the curricular level, at the level of English-speaking children. Didn't have to modify her curriculum in a way linguistically, in terms of content, especially for different levels of children. So there was this competing discourse. It shows up in the newspaper. And then when the Coady program opened up as a bilingual program, you see parents like Amy Porter's mother writing back to the newspaper saying this was the best thing that happened for my child. Now our children are able to get better jobs because they can be bilingual. So again, we see these similar discourses today, right? The gentrification of dual language programs and parents who see this sort of neoliberal approach to my children can get ahead. So by being bilingual and biliterate. It would be really worth digging into that. Parent attitudes today in the program, I think in the neighborhood school around Coady, parents and the educators, there is a really positive environment in the neighborhood school around Coady. There are educators that if you walk in today in the front door, even the security guard is the same security guard. He's been there for 25, 30 years and hasn't left. His children have all gone to the school. His grandchildren go to the school. Susanna went to the school. Her children went to the school. So this is a really a positive and a very bilingual, biliterate community. And within that microcosm, if you would, the parents are very affirming of the program. What I think we've missed over time is continuing to promote the positive outcomes from that program across the state, which is always a political battle, and demonstrating that over time nationally.
Okay, I'm taking organizer privilege here. If we can have like 2 more minutes of your time, because your response, those final bits of your response lead right into Carol Benson's question that I think would be a great way to end about the positive results of bilingual education. So I'm going to pass it over to Carol. She's going to ask you quickly, and then we'll move to the final minutes.
Okay. Sorry, I'm dying to ask you a million questions, but thank you so much for this presentation. Yeah, one of the things that you made me think of when you were talking about what a poorly done placement looked like at that time using surnames, and it reminds me, I was a bilingual teacher in California, and that's exactly how they placed the kids at the beginning of the year. But I was just wondering if you want to say anything about the messiness of the models, because I think that's what I see in other countries as well. When you're trying to have, when you're trying to say something about a model or how it's working, and then it's not a very clean thing. So I just wondered if you wanted to say anything about that. I remember that Thomas and Collier also talked about how difficult it was to categorize programs.
Yes, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. Even in the state of Florida, when the districts report back on what they have for program models, it's a mess. Okay, let me just say, it's not that simple. You can either choose developmental maintenance, which I don't understand that category, or transitional bilingual. So we haven't done a good job in our field, I think, with being a little more clear and also being a little more flexible about what really happens inside a classroom, inside a school, and inside a local community in terms of bilingualism, and to me, biliteracy development. So the core way, clearly, whatever the model was supposed to look like, they did have in mind trying to keep the language, native speakers of the language pretty even. And I don't think that's the case. I'd have to ask Susanna Martin, you know, if they had to identify English, native Spanish speakers. In fact, the children come in and they're very much already, many of them are already bilingual. They're bilingual, simultaneous bilinguals. And so you could say mother tongue, native speaker. These are sort of very structural categories that often don't make sense for the population of students coming into kindergarten or first grade. But the model really wasn't, you know, 50% in one language and 50% in the other language. What the interesting thing was that in the first 5 years of the program, actually between 1963 and really up until 1968, the children were very separated. They were structured. We wouldn't do this today. We would want social interaction and engagement, and we would place students for particular learning reasons with a particular teacher and be hopefully more thoughtful about those placements. But they didn't know what would happen. So they felt that it was safer to put all the English-speaking children together and the Spanish-speaking children together at the time. So they had this, you know, balance. But as you see, if you could go through and you could see through the archives, there was really virtually no 50% in one language and 50% in another language, except at the like third grade on after the beginning of the school year, 50-50 kind of instruction. And there was a tremendous amount of overlap in the content. Some people describe that as there was being double dosed. Diana Morales, whom I interviewed later, she's in the book, she said, well, I felt like we were double dosed in content, and that helped us learn, you know, so well. Many of the people that graduated became very successful and used their bilingualism and biliteracy. They felt double dosed in the content. But to the degree, it's really hard to know. I don't have the lesson plans, and the teachers didn't keep the lesson plans, just the schedule. So yeah, it was a messy process. There was no particular model, and that's why it was called the bilingual program. I think today we would call it maybe a two-way immersion program, maybe. Yeah.
All right, we're at 10:21. I want to thank Maria so much for giving us a wonderful way to end April, the month that we never imagined would turn out this way. And you've given us so much comparative food for thought. So what a wonderful way for all of us who are teaching to wrap up this semester and think about the US in comparative ways, think about policy, borrowing and lending from Ecuador to Miami to New York City and beyond. So just so much that you've shared with us. Thank you. Now you probably want to share with everyone what this is about the birthdays.
Yes, so I thought it would be good to give away some books. We have some books that we've received some grants. So we have these. I'm happy to send them wherever you are. You could be in Kazakhstan or Japan or wherever. We'll send some books. So that's why we asked if we figured the best way to do this was if whoever's birthday is closest to the date 3rd. Doesn't have to just September 3rd. So if your birthday is anywhere in August, September, or October, if you would please put it in the chat, and then we could take a look. And I thought I could get your address. You could email me and your personal address so you don't have to share. And then I will send you the book in the mail. So that would be
I've
really
been taking notes, so I've got the people and I've got the addresses. So
Oh,
as long as
good.
people have shared their birthday and month, we can determine who's
Okay.
close.
Thank you. That's great. It's great to see you all. I really appreciate the time.
Thanks so much. Thank you everyone for attending, and have a great end of April. Maria, best of luck on your sabbatical. We're all jealous.
Sabbatical, yes.
What a time to be on sabbatical, but yeah, I hope
It's always a good time to be on sabbatical.
I hope everybody stays safe in their countries. Really.
All right,
Yes,
and for
well.
everyone else,
Yes,
I
well.
will share the link on the Language Issues SIG website as soon as we have it up, and as soon as I deal on the technical side with getting that there. So thank you for
We may have a picture,
providing-
maybe. Did we get a group picture?
Oh,
Yeah.
Laura,
Okay.
okay.
In full fashion these days.
Yes.
If you allow me, I'll take the picture of my.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. 1, 2, 3. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank
All right, thanks everybody.
Howard, Bridget,
Thanks,
good to
Kara.
see you.
We'll
Very
touch
nice
with.
to see your name.
Very nice to see you, Maria.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care. Bye. Talk to you later, Kara.
Bye.
Bye.